introduction. And I'm really very happy to be here and very honored that you would trust me with your incredibly valuable time. Let me start with a picture of the great housing event in the first years of this millennium that convulsed the economy of the US and the economies of the world. Along the horizontal axis, what we would call the x-axis, is the change in housing prices between 2001 and 2006. Along the vertical axis, what we might call the y-axis, is the change in housing prices between 2006 and 2011. Now, I want you to take three things away from this picture. First, and most obviously, is the mean reversion, is the fact that the places that had the biggest booms had the biggest busts. Now, this is normal in housing markets. On average, every dollar that a housing market goes up over 5 years, it goes down by 32 cents over the next 5 years. But during this great convulsion, there was not 32-cent mean reversion. There was 95-cent mean reversion. Every dollar a housing market went up between 2001 and 2006, it went down by 95 cents. It was just a great storm that came and went, leaving financial wreckage in its wake. The second point that I want you to take away from this is the enormous heterogeneity of housing markets within the United States. There are some places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and Washington, D.C. that experienced enormous booms and significant busts, and some place, you can barely see it, but it's Houston up there, that it barely moved at all. And understanding why some markets have proven to be relatively safe havens while others have experienced giant roller coasters, like Tivoli theme park, is important for making wise investments in real estate. The third thing I want you to take away from this is the outliers. Now, two are down here. They're places that had astonishing busts given the size of their boom, Phoenix and Las Vegas. These were the places that never should have had booms at all. And the reason for this is that they're places in which it is very easy to build housing. America has a virtually limitless supply of sandy areas, and there are not regulations such as those that bind the growth of Paris or London, that bind in Las Vegas. Consequently, we have a textbook case of what introductory economics tells us should happen, which is when it's possible to build housing for $800 a square meter, then housing should cost $800 a square meter when there are no limitations on building, right? And indeed, that was true in Las Vegas for 40 years prior to 2003. And then all of a sudden, some giant mania came and infected the city, and prices tripled. This was the callable bubble, okay? And in some sense, I've been working on a history of real estate speculation in the United States over the last 240 years. The mistake that investors make over and over again is to underestimate the power of supply to set prices. So in many markets, in many housing markets, like Paris and London, right, supply is irrelevant. But in much of the world, supply does matter. And you could never make sensible decisions about, let's say, investing in second-tier cities in China without also thinking about how easy it is to build housing there. Now, last fact I want you to take away from this picture. It's the positive outliers, New York and D.C. The places that weathered the storm most bravely, most strongly, were the high-density coastal cities laden with human capital that have been, in some sense, the linchpin of America's economic recovery. If I look over the entire 1996 to 2012 period, and I just order metropolitan areas in the United States by their density level, what you see is that the densest fifth of America's metropolitan areas basically experienced all the meaningful housing price growth. That in fact, low-density America was a period of decline or stability at best, right? Whereas the places that boomed were the places where people teamed together, where people crowded. This is also true within metropolitan areas. Over the past 20 years, what you've seen is a huge tilt where price growth has favored the city center at the expense of the suburbs and exurbs. This is distance to the center of the city, the so-called central business district. And what you can see is the places that were closest, right at the hub, were the places that experienced by far the most housing price appreciation over the last 20 years. Now, this is part of a larger phenomenon, which is the subject of today's talk, the triumph of the city, which is the surprising success of urban areas, of urban density in the 21st century. In an era in which telecommunications supposedly allows us to connect effortlessly across the world, for some reason or other, face-to-face contact and the cities that enable that contact remain absolutely vital. In this case, what I've done is I've taken the 3,000-odd counties in the United States, and I've again ordered them on the basis of their density levels. Because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. What you can see in the lower line, the blue line, is the relationship between density and income. The densest tenth of America's counties have incomes that are 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is something economists call agglomeration economies. And while there are many things wrapped up in that, the fact that sometimes more skilled people choose to live in cities, or cities have access to other attributes like a good port or coal mines, but much of it is the fact that urban density actually makes us more productive. You see when workers come to cities that it's not that their wages shoot up overnight, but month by month, year by year, they experience fast wage growth. Through a process of human capital accumulation, the fact that we get smart by being around other smart people, the fact that cities are forges of human capital, places that immerse us in the kind of experiences that make us productive. Perhaps more surprising is the red line, which is the relationship between population growth between 2000 and 2010 and initial density levels. So whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. These are the same two lines for the European Union, looking at approximately 1,100 NUTS 3 regions. The blue line is again per capita income and density. In this case, the densest tenth of NUTS 3 regions have incomes that are twice as high as the least dense areas of the European Union. The relationship is stronger than it is in the United States. The relationship between population growth and density is slightly weaker, but of course, Europeans tend to be a little bit less mobile than Americans do, and so the population growth differences are a little bit less. But the basic patterns are exactly the same. It is in the densest parts of Europe where you see the most economic strength, the most cultural vibrancy, and the most promise for a brighter future. Now, whatever is happening in cities like Prague and Berlin and Amsterdam and Oslo and Stockholm and Copenhagen and New York, it is nothing relative to the urban transformation that is absolutely transforming the developing world. In 2007, the United Nations told us that we had become a 50% urban species, right? And it's hard on net not to think that that's generally a good thing. Because when you compare those countries that are more than 50% urban to those countries that are less than 50% urban, the more urbanized countries have incomes that are on average 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than 1/3. This is one way of visualizing the transformation of the world. What I've done is I've taken all of the poorer countries in the world, countries with per capita incomes below $5,000. And each bar shows you the share of countries in each income block that are more than 1/3 urban. So you can see, and I'm showing you this for both 1960 and 2010. The red bars are for 2010, the blue bars are for 1960. So you can see from this that those countries with per capita incomes between $4,000 and $5,000, and of course I've corrected for inflation for 1960. Those countries with per capita incomes between $4,000 and $5,000, about 80% of them were more than 1/3 urban in 1960, and about 80% of them are more than 1/3 urban today. Same thing is true between 3,000 and 4,000. Go down to the poorest countries. What share of countries with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more than 1/3 urban in 1960? It's an easy number to remember. 0, not a 1. Because in 1960, as had been true throughout almost all of human history, to be poor was to be rural, right? Today, more than 40% of these countries are more than 1/3 urban. And so we see the rise of megacities like Kinshasa and Karachi in places that are both poor and poorly governed, right? I continue to see great promise in this, but let's not fool ourselves, right? There are enormous challenges that come with urbanization. The spread of contagious disease, traffic congestion, high housing prices, often crime, right? There are demons that come with density, and they require management. And in some sense, managing the cities of the developing world better remains one of the great vocations of the 21st century. Now, frequently when I'm in the developing world, government leaders will ask me, great, you're an expert on cities. Tell me how I stop all these poor people from coming to my city, right? Which I don't think is the answer, and I try to persuade them of that. And this is the type of fact that I like to use. What you're looking at here, again, among countries with per capita incomes below $5,000, is the relationship between urbanization in 1960 and growth between 1960 and 2010. And what you can see is not a perfect, but a quite robust positive relationship, that those poorer countries that were more urbanized in 1960 have experienced more growth since then. And indeed, even in Africa, right, a country where 15 years ago there was a whole rush of articles about urbanization without growth, the past 10 years have seen something of a brighter path for Africa, and the cities of sub-Saharan Africa have helped to make that happen. Now, the economic success of cities is often derided as being a false thing that undoes the beauties of rural existence, right? Gandhi, perhaps above all, is associated with the view that urbanization is a great mistake for India, right? He said these lines, I regard the growth of cities as an evil thing, unfortunate for mankind and the world. Now, on this one, I think the great man was completely and totally wrong, okay? And he's wrong because it's not just about economics. It's about everything else that comes with cities. It's about the fact that we are a social species that thrives on connections with other people. And I want to show you a summary statistic that sort of makes this point. These are happiness data, self-reported life satisfaction, coming from the World Values Survey throughout the world. And the zero line tells you, in countries with a zero, people who live in urban areas and people who live in rural areas say that they're about the same in terms of their happiness. When it's below zero, the urbanites say that they're less happy. When it's above zero, the urbanites say that they're more happy. So you can see there, you can see Sweden, it's right up there, poking up above Finland. Sweden, the urbanites say that they're slightly happier than the rural dwellers, but the difference isn't huge. Norway is slightly below zero, but really just slightly. And in general, rich countries don't have big differences on this. New Zealand probably be the most prominent exception, but anyone who's ever been to rural New Zealand knows that that's, you know, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world with fjords practically like yours and rainforests thrown in at the same time. Whereas go to the poorer parts of the world, go above all to India, right? India stands out on this graph, doesn't it? It happens to be the country where above all, urbanites say that they're happier than rural dwellers, right? So Gandhi's country is not a country that's marked by urban misery. It's a country where there is no future in rural poverty. And indeed, right, India above all is a place in which if we're going to get a brighter, stronger, more economically vital India, more democratic world, right, it's the cities of India and sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America that are going to make that happen. Now, that rosy picture of cities that I've just pointed is clearly at odds with the New York City of my youth. I was born on the island of Manhattan in 1967, and these are two iconic images from New York City during the decade that was to follow. New York City had once had the largest industrial cluster in the United States. In the 1950s, right, automobile production in Detroit was dwarfed by garment production in New York City. And those garment industry jobs were killed off by globalization, right? Killed off by a move to cheaper places of making clothes. Hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs lost over a few short years. Accompanying deindustrialization was social chaos. Crime rates skyrocketed, and the city government could not pay its bills. It went to Washington, hat in hand, asking for a bailout, and you can see what President Ford sort of told them, right? But in those years, it didn't just look like President Ford who was denying New York's request for a bailout. It felt as if history itself was telling the older, colder cities of the US and of the European Union that they were dinosaurs, that they were headed for the trash heap, that their time had come and gone, and that we'd be looking forward to a future. And here it's Jimmy Carter, the next president after Ford, wandering through the wasteland that the South Bronx had become. We were looking forward to a future in which the once proud towers would crumble and the weeds would come up and pull them down to the ground. I'm always reminded of that image from the movie of that era, Planet of the Apes, where at the end of the movie, the Statue of Liberty comes poking up out of the sand. And in some sense, that captures the view of sort of urban loss that was prevalent during that time period. Of course, this is not just about the US. This is Liverpool in the 80s, right? You don't get starker than that. Liverpool also lost half of its population, right? All of these cities that were built on ports, right, and then featured heavy industry built around the port were hammered because of high labor costs, because of declining transportation costs, and all of their industry moved to cheaper areas, right? This is the cost of moving a ton a mile by rail over the course of the 20th century. At the start of the 20th century, it made sense to make automobiles in Detroit because you had access to a great rail network, because you had access to the Great Lakes. By 1960, that had become irrelevant. And factories moved to places where labor was cheaper, right? In the South, in states that were anti-union rather than pro-union, and of course it moved across the seas. It moved to Asia, it moved to lower cost locations. And cities were hit hard with this rise of deindustrialization. On top of that, of course, was another centrifugal technology, a technology that pulled people away from the center of cities, and that was the car. The car itself, an example of urban genius, an example of one of those chains of collaborative creativity that have powered humanity's greatest hits for thousands of years, right? It starts in Germany, which comes up with the internal combustion engine, and then in Detroit, where a chain of genius manages collectively to figure out how to mass produce inexpensive automobiles. Now, on one level, right, that was a great short-term product for Detroit, making it, by some measures, the most productive place on the planet in the 1930s and 1940s, right, giving its workers $5 days, unimaginable riches for the time, enabling far-flung farmers to find connections and mobility that they never would have had, right? But in the long run, this was a recipe for urban disaster. Successful cities at the start of the 21st century, just like successful cities at the start of the 19th century, are marked by three things: smart people, small firms, and connections to the outside world. The world of heavy-duty industry is not an urban world, right? It's a world of large firms that are walled off from outside areas, and you might as well put those factories in some cheap location. You don't need to put them in the city center. All right. And of course, this sprawl caused a rechanging of the way people live. We have always built our urban areas around the transportation technologies that were dominant. Our oldest cities are walking cities. Then we built cities around streetcars, cities around trains. Of course, car-based living was going to happen as well. But car-based living is radically different because cars are point-to-point technologies that don't require any walking at all. And so they both consume vast amounts of space and enable the consumption of vast amounts of space. And federal policies, national policies that encourage automobiles did grave damage to cities. Each highway that cut into a metropolitan core after World War II reduced the central city's population by about 18%, according to the work of Nathaniel Baum Snow. This drop in transportation costs enabled people to move to places they wanted to live instead of places where firms had a productive advantage. And we see this in many different ways. I've talked about it as the rise of the consumer city, and I'll come back to that because I think we see that in the strength of many Scandinavian cities. But in the US, the rise of the consumer city meant, above all, a move to warmer locations. Right? This is a relationship between population growth, 2000 to 2010, and January temperature in the US. If you wanted to explain which areas grew and which areas shrank over the course of the 20th century in the US, January temperature, as odd as it seems, is the most predictive variable you've got. Now, I live in Boston, a country that has a climate that is not unlike Oslo at about this point in time. In fact, I'm very glad that you managed to make me feel at home by giving me cold temperatures when I got off here. And, you know, like many people who live in cold areas, I think it builds character in my children that they grow up in this area. So I think this move to warmer locations shows a terrible lack of character in the part of the United States. But there's no doubt that this is occurring. This is about several things. It's about pro-business policies in the South. It's about the fact that southern cities like Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, and Phoenix make it relatively easy to mass-produce housing. But it is also about the fact that Americans like warmer winters. Strange as it may seem, Europeans seem to like warmer winters too. This is exactly the same graph over the last 10 years using NUTS 3 regions as well. Again, warmth is a predictor of population growth. Now, there were a variety of different attempts to fix declining cities in the EU, in the UK, and in the US. Many of them were infrastructure intensive. Now, and many of these were acts of great folly. This was Detroit's people mover monorail. Okay? So this was come up in the 1970s. Clearly some member of the president's administration had visited Disney World, where they actually have a monorail, and they like the monorail there. But the hallmark of declining cities is that they have an abundance of streets and an abundance of homes relative to the level of demand. Detroit was built for 1.85 million people. It now has only 700,000 people, right? Homes in Detroit, even in 1980, more than 90% of the homes in Detroit were valued significantly below construction costs. It never made sense to build new housing with federal dollars in Detroit, and it certainly never made sense to subsidize a monorail that glides over, look at the streets below, empty, right? The streets are empty. You can run a bus on the streets of Detroit at any speed you want, right? You don't need a monorail to glide over it, emptily moving these things. Now, Detroit's problems are still with us, as are many urban areas in the US, but many cities have come back. And the way I view the landscape is not that the triumph of the city is universal, but the triumph of the city is spotty, that some places have managed to come back and some places have not. And it is critical when we think about investment opportunities for the 21st century in cities to understand why and where the differences occur. Now, one of the prime examples of a city that managed to reinvent itself is the city of Seattle. Right? In 1971, two jokers put up a billboard on the way out of the city asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights, right? Because just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. and Boeing had been cutting back its jobs. This is before Amazon, right? Before Costco, before Starbucks, right? Before Microsoft. All of these companies helped Seattle come back. And indeed, we see this in European capitals too, like former industrial cities like Milan that have reinvented themselves as capitals of design or ideas or culture. Now, above all, the variable which predicts which colder cities have managed to reinvent themselves and which cities are succeeding, it's education, right? It's human capital that determines the success of individuals, of countries, and of cities. This is the relationship between the share of the population with a college degree as of the year 2000 and subsequent population growth. Again, I've just ordered metropolitan areas on the basis of this. And as you can see, population growth is about 3 times higher in the most educated metropolitan areas than in the least educated metropolitan areas. This is a fact that has been going on for at least 60 years. This is the relationship between earnings and college education across metropolitan areas. As you can see, the most educated American places, places like San Jose, which includes California, have earnings that are 4 times higher than the least educated parts of the United States. Really enormous differences. And the economics jargon for this is human capital externalities, because it's not just that your skills are making you more productive. It's your skills are making your neighbors more productive. The literature on this shows that typically as the share of adults in a metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10%, right, your earnings go up by 10% as well, holding your years of schooling constant. And all of us know this from our own experiences, right, that we get good things by being around smart people, that this is how learning occurs. It's also true even more so in the developing world. This is what I particularly like because it shows that very long-run differences in education can have current impacts. What I'm looking at here is the share of people in the province in China who passed the exam to become a bureaucrat in the Ming Dynasty, right? So this is a measure of Ming Dynasty education, and it still predicts population growth today. Right? Just as educational variables in the US and Europe from the 19th century predict success during the 21st century. Now, what's going on here? 30 years ago, 25 years ago when I started working on cities, the experts, the prognosticators of the future, the cyberseers, the technoprophets, all predicted that the death of distance would mean a death of urban life as well. They predicted that we would all disperse ourselves to electronic cottages and communicate via, in those days it was the fax machine, right? But now we have better ways. But that hasn't happened, has it? Right? In so many ways, in so many different contexts, cities have done well. And I submit to you that the argument for this is what globalization and new technologies have done is that they have radically increased the returns to being smart. They've radically increased the returns to being innovative, because now you can invest, because you can innovate, because you can sell on a global scale. Cities help us get smart. Cities help us learn from one another. Cities empower those chains of learning that have always been responsible for what we have done that's most magical, right? This is a picture of Bloomberg's Wallace office at Bloomberg City Hall. And there are at least 3 reasons for having this up here. One of which is that Bloomberg is part of a chain of creativity that occurred in New York City and elsewhere in finance that's responsible for the world that we see around us. This starts with Milton Friedman and Jimmy Savage in the walls of the social science building at the University of Chicago, who figure out a quantitative approach for thinking about the trade-offs between risk and return. This is then brought to finance by people like Sharpe and Harry Markowitz, right, who figure out the basics of quantitative finance, the stuff that all of us today take for granted. Then this quantitative approach to finance was brought to Wall Street, embodied in people like the young Jack Traynor and the young Fisher Black, right, who then began to teach investors how to think about the trade-off between, taking risks and what you should expect to pay for it. This quantitative approach then enabled, right, the young Michael Milken to convince investors that his high-yield debt, junk bonds if you must, carried enough yield to offset the risks. Those junk bonds then enabled the young Henry Kravis to use them to engage in larger and larger leveraged buyouts, like the one that took on RJR Nabisco, that squeezed value out of underperforming American assets. Right? Securitization and Lou Ranieri is part of that chain, and the reason why I like to mention Lou Ranieri is he starts in the Salomon Brothers mailroom. I can't think of an example of cities as forges of human capital that's any better than a kid starting in a mailroom and ending up being a pioneer of a quantitative industry like securitization. Of course, Bloomberg is part of this. His terminals are the muscles that enable the quantitative approach to finance to work. Right? In some sense, he's part of that chain. There's 2 other reasons the way I like this picture. One of which is that Bloomberg is actually not a financial billionaire, of course. He's an information technology billionaire. And in some sense, he's competing with the guys in Silicon Valley. But he is able to compete with them so successfully because he knows something that you can't learn by hanging out with software engineers in Atherton or in Palo Alto. He knows what the guys at Merrill Lynch wanted on their desks. Okay? He knew that because he had run the trading operation at Salomon Brothers, because he had run their tech support, and when he went to start his own firm, he knew exactly the product that he wanted to deliver. The city had made him smart. Third reason I like this, Wallace Office. Based on the Wallace Office, Bloomberg LLP, based on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. When you think about it, trading floors are something of an anomaly. Here we have some of the wealthiest people in the planet who in a normal industry like automobiles or aircraft like Boeing would be occupying large offices behind huge desks, enjoying all the privacy that their wealth has made possible. Here they are in a trading floor and they're right on top of each other. They're sweating on each other. If Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker is to be believed, they're getting guacamole on each other with some degree of regularity. Here they are, right? They're foregoing all of that privacy. Why? Well, we all know why. Because information is more important than space. Because you learn by being around other traders. Because, in fact, that's the key to success in the modern financial world. That's everything that you're hearing today from SKAGEN is about knowledge. Right? And we get smart by being in the thick of things. In some sense, the trading floor is the city writ small. Right? And it's a symbol of why cities have managed to succeed, because globalization and new technologies have made knowledge more important. You know, in a more complicated world, as ideas become more complex, it is easier for those ideas to get lost in translation. Right? Anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through. And we have, as human beings, these wonderful cues for communicating comprehension or confusion that are lost when we're not in the same room with one another. Face-to-face contact just makes the flow of knowledge that much better. Now, I've also put up the Googleplex. You know, and I'm often asked, don't I think that new technologies are going to finally end all this, that you know, we're no longer going to need to communicate face-to-face? And I really don't. I really don't think it's very easy for new technologies to overrule millions of years of human evolution. And in some sense, Google is evidence on my side. Here we have the company, right, which above all should be able to do long-distance working best. Do they send everyone home? Right? Did Yahoo under Marissa Mayer say, go home, don't work? Right? No. Google doesn't do that. Google says, come here, work right on top of each other, be connected to everybody all the time, right? Get rid of walls, get rid of space. This is how creativity works. And Silicon Valley is the most famous example of a geographic cluster in the 21st century, and it is also the industry that is most on the cutting edge of having technologies, many of which enable them to leap over continents, right? These new technologies are a friend of face-to-face contact, not an enemy of it, right? This just shows you the remarkable correlation within New York between the density at the zip code level and earnings per employee, right? Typically, as density at the metropolitan area goes up, earnings go up by 6%. As it doubles, earnings go up by 6%. Within Manhattan, as density doubles, earnings go up by 35%, right? There's just an incredible tendency for the densest parts of New York to be far more productive. Now, I like to put up this slide because people under the age of 35, and we're going to be talking about the millennials later, tend to think that technology is something that was invented in Stanford in 1966. Of course, that's not true. Cities have been depending upon technology for millennia. Probably the most important urban technology ever is this one, is the aqueduct, and I'll come back to water later. But in fact, getting clean water in and getting sewage out is the single most central thing that cities have. Now, technological changes are sometimes centrifugal. They sometimes, like the car, disperse people from cities, and sometimes they're centripetal. Sometimes they draw people in. And I think we're very much in a centripetal moment. This is, you know, a Zip van. Zipcar, like Airbnb, is often billed as being one of the harbingers of the sharing economy. But there's nothing new about sharing in cities. What is an urban restaurant other than a shared dining room and a shared kitchen? What is an urban park other than a shared backyard, a shared piece of property that we all can use together, right? Cities have long been about sharing. What the new technologies enable us to do is to share more things. So why didn't we have Zipcar when I was a kid growing up in New York City? And to help remind you what New York City in the 1970s was like, anyone see Taxi Driver? Right? Anyone see any of these nice gritty movies or watch an old Kojak episode? It was a gritty town, right? It was a town that was plenty of crime. Now, here's my image of what would have happened if you'd gone to Times Square to pick up your Zipcar. So you go there and you have your thing and you open up the car. And you know what you see? you find a dead body in the back seat, okay? Now, this would have been highly unpleasant, and you wouldn't have known what to do about it. Today, if there was a dead body in the back seat, you would have known the last person who had the car, the GPS could have taken care of it, and it doesn't happen, right? So what the technologies enable us to do is to share more stuff safely, to get into, I mean, almost, I cannot imagine, I mean, if you think from a New York perspective, in the 1970s, you would have gotten into a complete stranger's car and trusted that he would have taken you to some destination, right, without any license, without anything, right? And yet, today we all get into Ubers constantly, and we don't think twice about it. Technology has made that possible. Now, I'm going to talk about a little technological experiment that I've been doing, which tries to measure the change of cities. And this is part of using visual recognition techniques and machine learning in order to categorize urban change. This work starts with the work of Salazar Schechner and particularly Cesar Hidalgo. And it starts with crowdsourcing Google Street View images. And what they asked is, they went online and they asked thousands of people to rate which streetscape looks safer, okay? This one or this one. And people click through, they have hundreds of thousands of these clicks, and that enables them to get a rating for each of these things as to which one is perceived as being safer or nicer. In fact, interestingly, safety and beauty seem to be the same thing in these surveys, so the things that people think are attractive are things that people think are safe. But in fact, the areas that people say are safe are actually not safer, or more to the point, the places that people say are dangerous are not actually places where crime occurs. And the reason for that is that they're places that look horrible, and so nobody goes there on a Friday night, and so no crime occurs. Now, we then run this data, and this comes from the work of my co-author, the computer scientist Nikhil Naik. We can then take this training data and create a computer algorithm that can then reproduce the human judgment for millions of images, okay? So we go from a few thousand images that are actually crowdsourced to millions of images that use that as training data. And this is the type of thing. So this is these are very low street score numbers. So my point should be obvious from this, right? Look at the top one. This is a very low street score rating. So it's perceived as being unsafe. Who would spend their Friday night there, right, at that image? Who in the world would go wandering around that area? Whereas these are areas that are rated as being safe. What I got involved in this with looking at the changes in street score, the changes in perceived safety between 2007 and 2014. And this is a street that experienced a fairly large change. Some areas got better, some areas got worse. And with this, we can chart the change in neighborhood quality throughout the city, but the sub-city level. So for example, these bright dots are the places that experienced big improvements in the physical landscape. So you can see there's Brooklyn's upgrading, there's the west side of Manhattan, areas that have gone from being formerly industrial to being much more pleasant. What variables predict increases in street score? Well, initial education, right? Unsurprisingly, human capital is destiny, initial density, and the initial level of street score. Also, proximity to downtown. The growth is much higher when you're close to the city center than further away, and proximity to other well-educated, dense, and high street score areas. Gentrification oozes over time. It sort of moves out from one area to the next. We can also use this measure to actually quantify housing prices. So if we take as our training data not street score, but actually the value of a property, we can then create an algorithm. This is how it does. This is visually predicted price, and this is the location-based sales price. So this is connecting what the prices are and what we see. This is smooth data. We discovered a couple of nice points about prices, which go beyond just the fact that we can use an algorithm to predict prices. One of which is your neighbor's appearance is almost as valuable as your own in determining housing prices. As your neighbor's price goes up by 10%, your price goes up by 7%, meaning not their actual price, but their predicted price, how nice it looks. Your price goes up by 7%. Neighboring homes that you can see that are on the same street are worth a lot more than homes that you can't see on different streets. Homes that remodel experience typically a 4% upgrade in visually predicted value, and homes that went through foreclosure during the Great Crisis in the US experienced about 3% loss in external value, meaning in visually predicted value. So you can see the depreciation of the housing stock during the foreclosure crisis. Now, the human capital that matters for cities is not only, or not even primarily, the human capital that is taught in schools. I'm always amazed when anything I teach has any value in the real world whatsoever. It's the stuff that's learned on the city streets, and it's hard to think of anything that is more important for the long-run success of a city than the talent and inclination to be an entrepreneur. 50 years ago, the economist Ben Chinitz was comparing New York and Pittsburgh and found that New York was more resilient than Pittsburgh was even then. He argued that this was a reflection of New York's historic industry, the garment trade, which had lots of little firms, no economies of scale, and was a mother of entrepreneurship. And those entrepreneurs went on to do other things. Entrepreneurial human capital is fungible. They went on to start movie studios, right? They went on to start financial firms. By contrast, what did Pittsburgh have? Pittsburgh had U.S. Steel, vast vertically integrated company that trained company men. Very productive in the short run, not productive in the long run. It is amazing, given how mediocre our measures of entrepreneurship are, that they do such a good job of predicting urban success. So this is, 1 is the places with the smallest average establishments, 5 is the places with the largest average establishments, huge differences in economic growth. This is true within regions, within sectors. Now, the most entrepreneurial place I've ever been in my entire life is the Dharavi slum of Mumbai. Right? It is a place that just teems with Indian human capital. And it is a place where you walk through the shops and you just feel uplifted with the hope for India. And then you go outside and you see a child defecating in an unpaved road, and you realize the water isn't fit to drink, the electricity is intermittent, and disease moves through the streets with deadly consequences. It reminds us of the demons that come with density and how hard it was for our own cities to become healthy. This is the path of death rates in New York City over the past 200 years. A boy born in 1900 in New York could expect to live 3 years less than the national average. Today, expect to live 6 years less than the national average. Today, life expectancy is 3 years longer in New York than it is elsewhere in the country, right? That didn't happen by accident. America's cities and towns were spending as much on clean water at the start of the 20th century as the federal government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. Cities need infrastructure, but they also need institutions and incentives, right? They needed the Croton Aqueduct, but they also need rules that made people connect to the aqueduct. They need roads, but they also need pricing that gets them to use those roads efficiently. The economists Gilles Duranton and Matthew Turner have identified something called the fundamental law of highway traffic, which is that vehicle miles traveled increase roughly 1 for 1 with highway miles built. If you build it, they will drive it. Economists for 50 years have argued that the one solution for this is the solution that now Stockholm has, that Oslo has, congestion pricing. Singapore has had it since 1975, right? And if we introduce autonomous vehicles without charging for the roads that they use, we will all be stuck in traffic for more time rather than less because we've reduced the cost of sitting in traffic. So it really is vital that cities start pricing their roads. I'm going to skip over this, but this is a map of happiness in the US. And what we learned from this is that happiness is itself a large predictor of urban success. And it's not that the cities that are growing or the cities that are declining become unhappy. If you go back and you look at 50-year-old data, you find that places that were unhappy 50 years ago are doing poorly today. And in some sense, this is the background, right, for the rise of the consumer city. That if you think that global talent is the long-run determinant of urban success, then fighting for global talent by making cities that are fun, that are exciting, that are vibrant, and the cities of Scandinavia are superb in this regard, right? This is a major part of long-run economic success. In some sense, the most vibrant parts of the US are the skilled Sunbelt superstar cities, like Austin, Texas, like Charlotte, like Dallas. They're places that combine pro-business rules with education. And they're places that are full of promise for the American future, but they're also not necessarily the best business investments, best real estate investments. And let me explain why. One of the reasons why they're growing is they make it easy to build. And this is the point that I made in the beginning. I'm going to sort of wrap up with this point, that it is central when thinking about any real estate investment to remember the supply conditions on the ground. This is another way of looking at America. So what you have here is the relationship between housing price and our estimate of the physical cost of construction. A lot of America, housing prices are almost exactly the same as the physical cost of construction. Right? There are only a few places, San Francisco, urban Honolulu, San Diego, Washington, Boston, New York, where prices are way above the cost of construction. Right? And all of those places are places where there's very little building. Right? If you want to take one thing away from this, the places that build a lot aren't expensive, and the places that are expensive don't build a lot. This highlights the importance of supply in driving the differences across America. Those skilled Sunbelt superstars, great places to do business, not great places to invest in real estate because they make it easy to build. And indeed, when you look across the world, you see two possible scenarios, one of which is what you see in the east coast of the US or much of England, which is an excess of NIMBYism, not in my backyardism, knee-jerk opposition to any growth that keeps prices high, right, and makes it difficult to adapt. And I have Mumbai here, which suffers from this. And then on the other side, you have monumentalism, an excess of building. Now, when we think about the future of the cities of the developing world, right, both of these things are going on. And I'm just going to show, so this is New York, just going to show the boom in China and the US over the past. So this is China from 2003 to 2013. This is the US from 1996 to 2006. I want to make a couple of points for this, one of which is China's boom is vastly higher than anything we saw in the US, right? The top 3 lines are all for Chinese cities. The bottom 3 lines are for the US. Second point, China's boom has been accompanied by massive amounts of construction. The green line is construction in China. The orange line is construction in the US, again, during our boom. Massive amounts of building in China. Third, most surprisingly, the Chinese boom has been associated with massive amounts of inventory, both held by the developers, and that's what you're looking at, and high vacancy rates, and those are typically investment properties owned by individuals, right? And this is one way of visualizing the future of Chinese housing prices in second-tier cities. And I guess when it comes to the first-tier cities, Shenzhen, Shanghai, and Beijing, supply is relatively restricted and demand is virtually unlimited. But when you go to the second and third-tier cities, the ability to build new cities is just enormous. And these show my estimates, different possibilities for income growth and different amounts of construction. The dotted line shows the current annual supply between 2000 and 2010. And the heat map shows our predictions of what prices will be conditional upon this. So the only way you can beat a 3% return in these cities is if the supply shrinks radically and if income growth is through the roof, right? If the supply continues to be anywhere near what it currently is and price growth is reasonable, then you're going to see price declines. Last point. One reason why we care about urbanization in China is if the great growing economies of China see their per capita income levels rise, their per capita emission levels rise to that seen in the sprawling United States, global carbon emissions go up by 130%. If they rise to the level seen in wealthy but hyperdense Hong Kong, global carbon emissions go up by less than 30%. We all have a lot to gain if the cities of China triumph relative to seeing sprawl a la US, right? And the point that I want to make is that the places that look brown are frequently green. Right? Cities are actually relatively kind places to the environment because they're places in which we live in smaller apartments, in which we don't drive long distances. And in some sense, the building up, the creation of areas that are dense and brown is actually a sign that we're being kind to the environment. Whereas lots of green, leafy living, as in American suburbs, which come with large amounts of energy use and large amounts of driving, right, are signs that we're actually not being kind to the environment. So let me wrap up there, but I don't actually want to end on this. I just want to end on one slight point, which is I had a very gloomy conversation last night about the failures of Western democracy, and I share many of those fears. But I do want to leave you with an uplifting thought, which is over the past 3,000 years, right, there have been miracles that have happened in cities throughout the world, right? Those miracles are still happening. Those miracles which enable us to change, to create democracy, to create a brighter economic future, to create cultural innovations, those miracles are still around us. And it's hard when you think about that track record not to retain a fair amount of optimism for our future and the future of the entire world. So let me end there, and we have a little bit of time for questions, I think, Thea. So.
Thank you, Dr. Glaeser. Thank you so much for a very interesting speech. And I wanted to, before I kick it off with questions, I wanted to remind everybody in front of each person is a card for you to fill out if you have any questions for Dr. Glaeser or any of the other speakers. There will be staff collecting these cards, and I will get them and sift through as fast as I can and ask as many questions in 6 minutes and 32 seconds. But I think I'll kick it off with one question for you, Dr. Glaeser. Now, you're here in Norway, and you have a country where we spend billions of Norwegian kroners on bridges and tunnels to connect populations in areas outside the cities. And the argument is that in order to have a thriving society, you need to have a geographically diverse population. Now, if you had the oil fund money to play with in your side pockets, so we're talking about $1 trillion, what would your advice be to the Urban Planning Board of Norway to design the perfect Norway in 2100, shall we say? Going out a few years?
That's a wonderful question. So just to be clear, I'm not against all infrastructure, and I'm not against all forms of transportation connections at all, but I do believe that it is easier to waste tens of billions of dollars on infrastructure than it is on almost anything else. So do be cautious about connections. I personally think that Scandinavia has skewed remarkably urban over the last 30 or 40 years. And I think probably it's true that the weather has something to do with that. That in fact, when it's cold, it's nice to be closer together and to share common urban assets. So I think there's a lot that can be done to continue investing in the country as a whole, but spending a little more attention on Oslo and continuing things like the amazing Renzo Piano Museum are really tremendous jewels in the city and part of what makes it such a magical place to be in.
Excellent, thank you. Another question, which is, by the way, before I say anything else, if your chart on the temperatures, the average temperatures in the US as a predictor of population growth. I'm scared to think of next year with the deep freeze in New York, minus 20 degrees. I think we're looking at a negative population growth in the US next year. But the question, one of the questions I received is actually about real estate prices. A lot of Norwegians are invested in real estate, and we're wondering about are we looking at a potential bubble in the real estate market globally? Obviously realizing there are big differences between markets. What do you think? Is it sustainable or a bubble?
So it's only a couple of things are certain in real estate. One of which is price booms are almost inevitably followed by some form of price correction at some point in time. And that's almost an absolutely obvious truism. Is it clear when that will happen or how big it will be? It's very hard to say. In places where supply is relatively unrestricted, like those Chinese cities that I was telling you about, there it's fairly easy to call the bust, right? To say that something is likely to be corrected, as it was in the sand states of the US. In terms of thinking about Oslo, Stockholm, Copenhagen, it's much harder to say. These are places that are somewhat restricted in what they can build, both by geography and by regulation. But thinking that rising prices are going to continue inevitably is clearly an act of foolishness. So I wouldn't be comfortable calling any kind of a bust, but certainly being aware that prices are high by historical standards, and typically there are corrections after such high prices, is the path of wisdom, surely.
Thank you. Another question that comes up a lot when we talk about cities is the issue of health. And health is also connecting to the global trend of aging. So the question is, have there been any interesting studies on the cause and effect on aging and living in the city?
So that's a great question. I mentioned earlier that life expectancy is about 3 years longer in New York right now. Among older New Yorkers, among older urbanites, there are a lot of ideas about why they're healthier, right? Nothing has actually been proven, but there are a lot of ideas. So, for example, more social connections, more walking, for example, less time sitting in the car. These are all quite plausible. Among younger people, we know where urban health comes from, right? There are two obvious differences, one of which is motor vehicle accidents, which are just wildly lower among urbanites than they are around rural dwellers. It's just a lot safer to get home after a party in an urban dense area than it is in a rural area. The second reason, though, is that urbanites have lower suicide rates. And let me just go back for don't worry. On that happiness data, one of the outliers was that New York City residents actually tended to say that they weren't happy. Okay. Now, I'm a native New Yorker, and there's a certain cultural element to this. If any of you have seen a Woody Allen film, you kind of know that, to a New Yorker, telling a surveyor that you're really satisfied with your life is like saying that you're a moron, right? But on the other hand, New Yorkers are much less likely to commit suicide. Which I think is a sign that even though they say that they're annoyed, they actually are clinging to life more tenuously. And that's the second major reason why people in cities are healthier. Now, of course, the fact that New York weathered the AIDS pandemic reminds us that contagious disease is still a big threat in cities. And the fact that the cities of the developing world are dealing with disease with antibiotics rather than clean water creates a specter of antibiotic-resistant diseases that could plague all of us. So I think we need to continue to be vigilant on the area of contagious disease and its potential threats to cities.
Now, we're going to hear about millennials and their desire to live in the city in a little bit later today. But the question I have about millennials, are we looking at a potential trend globally where the very few select are actually able and can afford to live in these cities? And you have potentially an inequality problem on the horizon long term.
So unquestionably, this is one of the reasons why I like building more housing in cities, right? Is that, in fact, undue restrictiveness towards housing risks turning cities into boutique towns that are affordable only to the wealthy. And really, the only recipe towards affordability in New York and London and Paris is to build more housing. New York in the 1920s built 100,000 units a year, and it stayed affordable because of that. And it's the only way that we can make sure that cities actually open their arms to people of middle income rather than people of high incomes. So this is something that I worry constantly about. And let me just flip it on and said, it's why I hope for, as long as it's a soft landing, some correction of housing prices wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, as long as it doesn't happen to take down the financial system with it. Some degree of added affordability would be something of a plus.
Well, great. Thank you. Now I see it's flashing red here in front of me. I guess that means we're done. Thank you so much, Dr. Glaeser.
Thanks.
Thank you.